What if the monster you spent your life fighting, the one you built an empire to defeat, wasn't some shadowy competitor across the globe, but was right here, wearing your company's uniform and smiling in your face? What if the rot you swore to cut out of the world had taken root in your own home? For Julian Croft, the billionaire founder of Apex Retail, that nightmare was about to become a brutal reality. He tugged the brim of a grimy Chicago Cubs cap lower, the cheap fabric a foreign object on a head more accustomed to tailored success. He stepped through the automatic doors of his own flagship store, a ghost in his own machine. No one gave him a second glance, not the bored cashiers, not the security guard scrolling on his phone, and certainly not the store manager who was supposed to be the shining example of the Apex way. Julian had come to this location in the heart of Chicago, undercover for a reason. A small, nagging discrepancy in the numbers that didn't add up. But no spreadsheet, no financial report, could have prepared him for the sound that hit him next. It was a sound that cut through the cheerful pop music and the robotic beep of scanners. It was the sound of a human soul breaking. A desperate, muffled sobbing echoing from the stark white tiles of the employee restroom. Before we dive into the darkness lurking behind the pristine shelves of this store, do me a favor. If you believe that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You are not going to want to miss a single shocking second of what's about to unfold. Through the narrow crack under the door, a small silver name badge lay discarded on the damp floor. Elena Diaz, support staff. The sound from within wasn't just sadness. It was the raw, guttural cry of someone watching their world burn to the ground, helpless to stop the flames. A chill, colder than any Chicago wind, snaked its way up Julian's spine. Just 3 months ago, his corporate office had received a glowing report about this very location. Perfect scores in employee satisfaction. 0 formal complaints. A model of efficiency and morale. But the woman weeping behind that door was telling a story of her own, a story written in tears and terror. As he stood frozen under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights, a single, terrifying question seared itself into his mind. If this was happening right here, under his own nose, in a store he had built from the ground up, what else had he missed? The truth he was about to uncover would be far worse than anything he could have possibly imagined. It would force him to question everything he thought he knew about leadership, about loyalty, and about the true cost of looking the other way. What had started as a routine, anonymous visit was about to become the most important and agonizing 48 hours of his entire career. Stay with me, because what happens next will fundamentally change how you view the workplace and the people in power, forever. Julian knocked gently, his knuckles rapping softly against the cold metal of the restroom door. "Excuse me? Is everything all right in there?" The sobbing choked off instantly. He heard a frantic shuffling, the sound of someone desperately trying to piece themselves back together. I'm fine," a voice trembled. "Just give me a minute." But her voice was a transparent lie. This wasn't fine. This was the sound of a woman hanging on by a thread. When Elena Diaz finally emerged, Julian saw a petite Latina woman, maybe in her early 40s, though the exhaustion etched onto her face made her seem older. Her blue Apex Retail polo was wrinkled, and her dark eyes were puffy and red from crying. She bent quickly to retrieve her name badge from the wet floor, but her hands were shaking so violently she could barely close her fingers around it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum. "I shouldn't be. I need to get back to my work." Julian took a step closer, his gaze taking in the details his executive reports always missed. Elena's hands were cracked and raw, the skin inflamed from constant exposure to harsh cleaning chemicals. Deep, dark circles shadowed her eyes, the kind that come not just from a lack of sleep, but from the soul-crushing weight of carrying too many burdens for too long. But it was something else, something subtle, that truly caught his attention. It was the way she flinched, a small, almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders, when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the main sales floor. "You don't look fine," Julian said, his voice soft, gentle. "I'm Leo, by the way. Just started today." Elena glanced up, her eyes quickly assessing him, a silent calculation of risk and trust running through her mind. After a long moment, her shoulders sagged, the facade of composure crumbling under the weight of her exhaustion. "It's just everything," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "My son, Matteo, he needs a specialized treatment. His respiratory condition, it's getting worse, and I can't afford—" She cut herself off, shaking her head as if to physically stop the words from escaping. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear all this." "How long have you worked here?" Julian asked, keeping his tone casual. 3 years, she said. "Never missed a single day, never been late once." Her hand gestured helplessly toward a large bulletin board in the hallway, a chaotic mess of schedules and memos. Julian followed her gaze, and what he saw made his stomach clench into a tight, angry knot. The work schedule was a disaster. It was a Jackson Pollock of crossed-out shifts, arbitrarily reduced hours, and hastily scrawled handwritten changes. Elena's name appeared sporadically, like an afterthought. One week she was down for 20 hours, the next 35, then brutally dropped back to 15. There was no consistency, no pattern. It was impossible to build a budget, to plan a life, to breathe. "They keep cutting my hours," Elena explained, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear it. "Mr. Thorne says it's a new corporate policy, but I don't understand. The store is always busy. We're always understaffed." Julian's jaw tightened. He had written the corporate policy on scheduling himself. Full-time employees, those with over 30 hours a week consistently, were guaranteed stable, predictable hours. What he was looking at wasn't policy. It was deliberate, calculated manipulation. And when I asked about the health insurance, Elena's voice cracked, the sound of breaking hope, the one that was supposed to kick in after 90 days of full-time work, he said I wasn't eligible. He said my hours were too irregular to qualify. The pieces of a sickening puzzle were beginning to snap into place, forming a picture that made Julian's blood boil. He forced himself to remain calm, to keep playing the part of Leo, the new guy. "That doesn't sound right at all," he said carefully. Elena glanced around the empty hallway, her eyes darting nervously as if the walls themselves were listening. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There are others. Sam in electronics, Chloe in cosmetics. We're all having the same problems. But Mr. Thorne, he tells us that if we don't like it, there are 100 other people who would be grateful to take our jobs." A deep chill, one that had nothing to do with the store's air conditioning, ran down Julian's spine. Victor Thorne. He remembered the name from the management roster he'd reviewed before his visit. Regional manager, stellar performance reviews, no red flags in his file. At least none that had ever made it to the corporate office. "Listen, Leo," Elena continued, her voice now trembling with a desperate urgency. "I need this job. My son, he's only 8 years old, and without this treatment—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the unspoken fear too terrible to give voice to. Julian watched as she pinned her name badge back onto her uniform with trembling fingers. That small, insignificant rectangle of silver plastic represented everything to her. Her son's health, their rent, their food, their very survival. And someone he employed was using that desperation as a weapon against her. "I should go," Elena said, glancing toward the main floor. "My shift ends at 11, but I'm supposed to be back at 6 tomorrow morning for inventory." Mr. Thorne scheduled me for a double, but somehow the system only shows me getting paid for 8 hours. As she walked away, Julian noticed her slight limp. The result, he suspected, of years spent standing on hard concrete floors without the proper support. The Apex Employee Handbook clearly stated that all staff were entitled to anti-fatigue mats and ergonomic support. It was another policy, another promise that was apparently being ignored. Julian stood alone in the hallway, his eyes fixed on that chaotic schedule board. Each crossed-out shift represented a family scrambling to pay their bills. Each arbitrary hour cut meant a mother choosing between medicine for her child and gas to get to work. He had built Apex Retail on a single, unwavering principle. You take care of your people, and they will take care of your business. But somewhere in the vast, gaping chasm between his boardroom policies and the floor-level reality of this store, that principle was being systematically, brutally destroyed. The question was, how deep did this cancer go? And who else was suffering in silence while he sat in his ivory tower, insulated and oblivious to their pain? Julian didn't have to wait long to see the system in action. The next morning, he sat in the break room, nursing a cup of stale coffee, and watched as Elena clocked in for her 6 a.m. shift. She moved stiffly, clearly favoring her left leg, but her face was a mask of grim determination. Whatever battles she was fighting at home, she was here, ready to work. At precisely 6:47 a.m., Victor Thorne emerged from his glass-walled office. Thorne was exactly the kind of man Julian despised. Mid-30s, with hair that was too perfect, a suit that was too sharp, and the kind of oily swagger that comes from wielding a small amount of power over people with none. He wore his manager's badge like a medal of honor, and his eyes, like a predator's, immediately scanned the floor and locked onto Elena, who was mopping near the electronics section. "Diaz!" Thorne's voice was a whip crack that cut through the quiet morning hum of the store. Elena's shoulders tensed, but she kept working, her back to him. "Diaz, I'm talking to you." She finally turned, her face carefully composed. A blank slate. "Yes, Mr. Thorne?" "This floor is still filthy. What exactly have you been doing for the last hour?" Julian watched Elena's jaw tighten. The floor was immaculate. He could see the reflection of the overhead lights in the polished tiles. But she simply nodded. "I'll go over it again, sir." "You'd better. And next time, maybe try actually working instead of daydreaming about your problems." Thorne's voice dripped with a casual, practiced contempt. "Speaking of which, I need to see you in my office. Now." Julian felt his hands clench into fists under the flimsy break room table. He had to force himself to stay seated, to keep observing. If he intervened now, he'd blow his cover before he could understand the full scope of this disease. Inside Thorne's office, Elena stood while Thorne remained seated behind his large desk, a deliberate power play that made Julian's skin crawl. Through the glass partition, he could see Elena's posture shrink, her shoulders slump with every word Thorne spoke. Sam Chen, the young electronics clerk Elena had mentioned, slumped into the chair beside Julian in the break room. "Poor Elena," Sam muttered, shaking his head. "That's the 3rd time this week he's called her in there." "What's he saying to her?" Julian asked, keeping his voice low. Sam glanced around nervously, as if Thorne could hear them even through the walls. "Same thing he says to all of us. That we're lucky to have jobs, that people like us." He paused, searching for the right words. "That we should be grateful for whatever hours he decides to give us. You know, people like us. Immigrants, single moms, people who can't afford to just quit." Sam's voice was laced with a bitter resignation. "Thorne knows exactly who he can push around." Through the glass, Julian watched Thorne lean back in his chair, a picture of casual cruelty. Elena stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly behind her back like a soldier being dressed down. Then, Thorne did something that made Julian's vision flash red. He pulled out Elena's paper timesheet and, with a flourish, began making changes with a thick red pen right in front of her. Julian couldn't hear the words, but he could see Elena's face crumble as Thorne slashed through her recorded hours, a vicious red line canceling out her hard work. "He's cutting her time again," Sam whispered, his voice filled with disgust. "Probably claiming she took an unauthorized break or something. Last week he docked Chloe 3 hours for excessive bathroom usage. She's 6 months pregnant." Julian's hand moved to his phone, his thumb instinctively finding the voice recorder app. He needed evidence. Through the thin office walls, Thorne's voice suddenly carried, sharp and clear. "Told you before, Diaz. If you can't handle the workload without getting emotional, maybe this isn't the right job for you. There are plenty of people who would be grateful for your position." "Please, Mr. Thorne." Elena's voice was a fragile whisper. "I just need consistent hours. My son—" "Your personal problems are not my concern," Thorne snapped. "What is my concern is that I've heard you've been talking to other employees about scheduling. That sounds an awful lot like troublemaking to me." Julian's thumb hit record. "I wasn't making trouble. I was just what? Trying to organize some kind of complaint? Because that would be a very, very unfortunate decision for your employment status here." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. Elena fell silent. "Now, I'm cutting you back to 12 hours next week. Maybe that will give you some time to focus on your work instead of stirring up drama. And Diaz, if I hear you've been talking to anyone else about scheduling or policies or anything at all, we'll have a serious discussion about whether you're a good fit for the Apex family." Julian watched Elena nod silently, her dignity being stripped away, piece by painful piece. When she finally emerged from the office, her face was pale but strangely composed. She walked past the break room without looking in, her head held high in a silent act of defiance. But Julian had seen enough. The phone in his pocket now contained Victor Thorne's own words, a smoking gun that exposed the systematic, calculated abuse of power happening under the Apex retail name. As Thorne returned to his office, whistling a cheerful, tuneless melody as if he hadn't just shattered someone's week, Julian felt something cold and hard crystallize inside him. This wasn't just about Elena anymore. This was about every single vulnerable employee who had ever been ground down by a petty tyrant like Victor Thorne. The time for quiet observation was over. Now it was time to see just how deep this corruption really went. Julian left the store that evening with his mind racing, a tempest of fury and strategy. He drove his rented Ford Focus, a deliberately unremarkable car, nothing that would draw attention, back to the budget motel on the outskirts of the city where he'd been staying under his fake identity. In the stark anonymity of room 237, surrounded by scattered corporate reports and employee files, he began to plot his next move. He played back the recording from his phone, Thorne's venomous threats echoing in the small, stale room. Each word was a nail in the man's professional coffin, but Julian knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was just the tip of a very large and very ugly iceberg. If Thorne felt this comfortable openly threatening his employees, what was he doing when he thought no one at all was watching? Julian pulled up the store's employment records on his encrypted laptop. What he found made his stomach churn. Over the past 8 months, since Thorne had been promoted to regional manager, this store had seen a staggering 60% turnover rate among its hourly employees. The official reason listed for most departures was voluntary resignation. But Julian could read between the lines of the sterile HR data. People didn't just voluntarily leave jobs in this economy, not at this rate. They were driven out. They were broken. He cross-referenced the departure dates with Thorne's performance reviews. The irony was nauseating. On paper, Victor Thorne was a superstar. Labor costs were down 23%. Efficiency ratings were through the roof. There were 0 formal complaints filed with HR. On paper, Victor Thorne was a model manager, the very picture of Apex leadership. But Julian was beginning to understand the sick genius of Thorne's system. Keep your employees desperate and terrified. Prevent them from ever working enough consistent hours to qualify for benefits like health insurance or paid time off, and make damn sure that anyone who might have the courage to complain simply disappeared from the roster. It was a perfectly elegant and utterly cruel system of exploitation. Julian opened a new, secure browser window and began to meticulously craft a deeper cover story. Leo Carter, a laid-off construction worker from out of state, desperate for any job he could get. No family to worry about, no local ties, just a man grateful for the opportunity to work. He was creating the perfect employee for Victor Thorne to exploit. He practiced the persona in the bathroom mirror, consciously slumping his shoulders, altering his speech patterns, even changing his walk. Julian had grown up in neighborhoods like this one, long before his business had taken off. He knew how to blend in. The key wasn't to act, it was to remember. The next morning, Julian returned to the store, his $600 shoes swapped for a pair of worn-out work boots he'd bought at a thrift store. He approached Thorne's office with a carefully calibrated mixture of desperation and eagerness. "Excuse me, Mr. Thorne. I heard you might have some openings. I'm willing to work any shift, any hours you need. I'm a hard worker." Thorne looked up from his computer, his eyes cold and assessing, instantly cataloging this new potential victim. Julian could practically see the calculations running through the man's mind. Another piece of meat for the grinder. Experience? Construction, mostly, but that dried up, Julian said, letting a hint of weary defeat enter his voice. "I just need steady work. I'm not picky. Cleaning, stocking, whatever you've got. You got references?" Julian handed over a carefully fabricated resume, complete with fake references he'd arranged through his head of security. "These guys will vouch for me. I show up on time, I work hard, and I don't cause problems." A slow, predatory smile spread across Thorne's face. "I like that attitude, Leo. I like it a lot. Tell you what, I can start you in custodial. Night shift, minimum wage. You'll be working with Elena, but a word of advice, don't let her fill your head with her sob stories. The woman has a real talent for drama." The casual, dismissive cruelty in Thorne's voice made Julian want to reach across the desk and wipe that smirk off his face, but he forced himself to nod eagerly. "That sounds perfect, sir. Thank you. When do I start?" "Tonight, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And Leo." Thorne leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "I reward loyalty and hard work. Employees who understand how things work around here, they do very well. Employees who cause trouble, they don't last long." Julian nodded as if he understood perfectly. And he did. Just not in the way Victor Thorne intended. That evening, Julian changed into his new work clothes in the grimy employee bathroom, the cheap polyester of the Apex polo scratching against his skin. He pinned his temporary name tag to his shirt, the plastic rectangle feeling alien and insulting after years of bespoke suits and boardroom meetings. When Elena arrived for the night shift, she looked surprised to see him. "You came back," she said, her voice quiet. "Told you I needed the job," Julian replied, forcing a weary smile. "Guess we're partners in grime." Elena studied his face for a moment, a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, in her tired eyes. She seemed to sense something different about this new employee, but couldn't quite place what it was. "Stick close to me tonight," she said finally, her voice resigned. "I'll show you the ropes." She leaned in a little closer. "And Leo, everything I told you yesterday about being careful around Mr. Thorne, double it for the night shift. That's when he does his worst work." As the main store lights dimmed and the last customers filtered out into the Chicago night, Julian felt the immense weight of what he was about to discover. Somewhere in the next 8 hours, in the echoing silence of the empty store, he would learn the full, horrifying extent of Victor Thorne's shadow operation. He was no longer just observing the problem from a safe distance. He was about to live it. The store transformed after closing time. What had been a brightly lit, bustling retail environment during the day revealed its true skeletal nature in the stark, fluorescent-lit shadows of the night shift. Julian followed Elena through her grueling routine, learning the intricate, exhausting choreography of overnight custodial work. But within the first hour, he began noticing things that made his blood pressure steadily rise. "Elena, why are you cleaning the employee break room with the same supplies we use for the bathrooms?" he asked, watching her rinse a mop in a bucket that reeked of industrial disinfectant. She glanced over her shoulder, a nervous, habitual gesture before answering. "Mr. Thorne cut the cleaning supply budget again. Says we were being wasteful." She held up a nearly empty, generic bottle of floor cleaner. "This has to last us the whole week, for the entire store." Julian knew the corporate allocation for sanitation supplies for a store this size. This location should have had 10 times what he was seeing. Thorne wasn't just cutting corners. He was pocketing the difference. At 11:30 p.m., Thorne made his first appearance of the night. He didn't walk. He prowled through the cavernous aisles like a predator surveying his territory, his expensive shoes clicking ominously on the polished concrete. When he found Elena restocking paper towels in the customer restrooms, his voice sliced through the silence. "Diaz, you're moving too slow. At this rate, you'll be here until sunrise." "I'm working as fast as I can, Mr. Thorne." "Not fast enough. I'm docking 30 minutes from your timesheet for inefficiency." Julian watched from behind a tall display of breakfast cereal as Thorne pulled out his phone, his thumb tapping on the screen. 30 minutes of pay. Stolen from a woman who was already working a double shift, right in front of his eyes. But it was about to get so much worse. At 1:15 a.m., Thorne returned, this time with a clipboard in his hand. "Diaz, Carter, my office." They gathered in the main aisle as Thorne consulted his notes, a smug look on his face. "Corporate's been asking some questions about our labor costs, so, starting next week, we're going to be implementing some new efficiency measures." He smiled, as if he were about to announce a round of bonuses. "Instead of 2 people on night custodial, we're going back to 1. Elena's face went pale. "Mr. Thorne, this is a 45,000 square foot store. One person can't possibly—" "One person can, and one person will," Thorne interrupted smoothly. "Elena, since you've been here longer, you get to keep the position. But you'll be expected to handle the full workload in the same 8-hour time frame." Julian did the math in his head. The work the two of them were doing tonight was already pushing the limits of human endurance. Asking one person to do it all wasn't just impossible, it was a deliberate setup for failure. "If you can't handle it," Thorne continued, his eyes glinting with malice, "I can always find someone who can." After Thorne swaggered away, Elena slumped against a checkout counter, her body trembling. "I can't do this whole store by myself," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But if I complain, I'll lose the job entirely," Julian finished for her, the cold, hard logic of Thorne's trap snapping into focus. She nodded, tears of frustration and exhaustion forming in her eyes. "My son's treatment, it's scheduled for next month. I need the insurance." That's when Julian noticed something that made his investigative instincts ignite. Thorne had left his office door slightly ajar. Through the gap, Julian could see him at his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Elena, can you handle the East Wing by yourself for a few minutes? I need to check something in the back." She looked confused but nodded wearily. "Be careful, Leo. If he catches you snooping—" Julian moved like a shadow. his work boots silent on the polished floor. He positioned himself just out of sight, angling his phone to see through the crack in the door. What he saw on Thorne's computer screen made his hands shake with a white-hot rage. Thorne was logged into the employee scheduling system, and he was systematically reducing the hours for a dozen different employees. But he wasn't just cutting their time. He was redistributing those stolen hours to a phantom employee, a ghost on the payroll named V. Thorne, Jr. Victor Thorne was stealing hours from his most vulnerable workers and assigning them to a fake account, probably a shell he controlled himself. Every hour he stole from Elena, from Sam, from Chloe, was going directly into his own pocket. Julian's phone was recording everything, the evidence damning and irrefutable. But then he saw something even more monstrous. Thorne opened another program, the Apex Health Insurance Enrollment System. He pulled up Elena's file. With a few clicks of the mouse, he changed her employment status from full-time eligible to part-time temporary, despite the fact that she had been working full-time hours for 3 years. With a few casual keystrokes, Victor Thorne had just denied Elena Diaz the health coverage her sick child desperately needed for his treatment. Julian felt a rage so pure, so absolute, that it took every ounce of his self-control not to burst through that door and tear the man apart with his bare hands. But he forced himself to stay still, to keep recording, to document every click, every theft, every casual, cruel destruction of a family's future. At 3 a.m., Thorne emerged from his office looking smug and satisfied. "Carter, I need you to move all these pallets from the back stockroom to the main sales floor, by yourself." Julian looked at the mountain of boxes. It was easily a 4-person job, a clear violation of company safety protocols. "All of them." "Is there a problem with that? Because I can find someone who won't give me any attitude." "No problem," Julian said through gritted teeth. As he began the back-breaking work, moving hundreds of pounds of merchandise alone, Julian understood something crucial. This wasn't just about money for Victor Thorne. This was about power. It was about the sadistic joy of watching people struggle, of holding their lives and their hopes in his hands and squeezing just to watch them suffer. By 4 a.m., Julian's back was screaming in protest, and his hands were raw and bleeding. But he had gathered enough evidence to destroy Victor Thorne's career 10 times over. Wage theft, benefits fraud, creating unsafe working conditions, workplace harassment. It was a masterclass in how to abuse every labor law on the books. But as dawn approached, and he watched Elena limping through her final tasks, barely able to stand after 10 hours of brutal, relentless work, Julian realized something that changed everything. This wasn't just about one monstrous manager anymore. This was about a system that allowed predators like Thorne to thrive, while good, hard-working people like Elena suffered in silence. And that system started at the very top, with him. Tomorrow, he swore, it would all come to an end. But first, he needed one more piece of evidence, the one final, undeniable smoking gun that would make his case unshakable. Julian's opportunity came at 5:30 a.m. The night shift was winding down, the first hints of dawn staining the Chicago sky. Thorne had disappeared back into his office for what he called his end-of-shift paperwork. Julian had noticed a pattern over the past few hours. Every 30 minutes, like clockwork, Thorne's office phone would ring with a distinctive, custom ringtone. 2 short bursts, followed by a longer one. Each time, Thorne would answer in hushed, conspiratorial tones, speaking for exactly 3 to 4 minutes before hanging up. As Elena began gathering the cleaning supplies for the final sweep, Julian made his decision. "I'm going to empty the trash bins in the office area," he told her, his voice casual. Elena looked concerned. "Mr. Thorne doesn't like anyone near his office when he's doing his paperwork." "I'll be quick." Julian grabbed a large trash bin and pushed his cart toward the administrative hallway at the back of the store. The hallway was dimly lit, with Thorne's office at the far end. Through the frosted glass of the door, he could see Thorne's silhouette hunched over his desk. Then the phone rang. 2 short bursts, 1 long. Julian ducked into the narrow supply closet adjacent to Thorne's office, positioning himself where he could hear clearly but remain hidden from view. He pulled out his phone and hit record for the last time. "Thorne here," he heard Victor answer, his voice low but perfectly audible through the thin wall. "Yeah, I got your numbers for this week. Diaz is down to 12 hours. Chen's at 15. The pregnant one, Chloe, I'm putting her on heavy inventory duty next week. That should make her quit within a month." Julian's blood ran cold. Thorne wasn't just a lone wolf. He was reporting to someone. He was part of something bigger. No complaints filed. They're all too scared to go to corporate. I've made sure of that." Thorne chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "The beauty of it is corporate just sees our labor costs dropping and they think I'm some kind of efficiency genius." The voice on the other end was muffled, but Julian could make out a question about documentation. "Of course I'm covering my tracks. I've got fake performance reviews written up for all of them. Attitude problems, reliability issues, you know the drill. If anyone from HR ever asks, I've got a paper trail a mile long showing they deserved everything they got." Julian heard the rustle of papers as Thorne pulled out files. "Here's the beautiful part. I'm billing all their cut hours to my nephew's employee ID. Kid's making $800 a week and he's never even set foot in the store. Corporate pays the wages into an account I control, and I just pocket the difference." The conversation continued for another minute, with Thorne detailing how he'd been running this scheme across multiple stores in his region, not just this one. Every single word was a confession, captured on Julian's phone, a complete admission of federal wage theft, conspiracy, and wire fraud. But then, Thorne said something so monstrous, so utterly devoid of humanity, that it made Julian's hands tremble with a rage he had never known. "The Diaz woman is the perfect target. Single mother, desperate for the insurance, never speaks up. I could cut her to 0 hours and she'd still show up the next day begging for a shift. Her kid needs some kind of special treatment for his lungs, so she'll take whatever abuse I dish out. The casual cruelty. The way Thorne spoke about Elena's desperation not as a tragedy but as a tool for his own amusement pushed Julian past his breaking point. "Yeah, I know the type," Thorne continued, his voice oozing with contempt. "These people are grateful for scraps. They think they're lucky to have any job at all. Makes them real easy to control." Julian heard Thorne's chair creak as he leaned back. "Don't worry about exposure. Who's going to believe them? A bunch of immigrants and high school dropouts against a regional manager with stellar performance reviews? Corporate would laugh them right out of the building." The call ended with Thorne scheduling another check-in for the following week. As Julian heard the phone click back into its cradle, he knew he had it. He had just recorded a complete confession, not just to the crimes Thorne was committing, but to his entire depraved philosophy of exploitation. Julian quickly backed away from the office, his heart pounding in his chest. He had everything he needed: the recorded calls, the computer screen footage of Thorne manipulating timesheets, photographic evidence of the unsafe working conditions, and now this. Thorne's own words, proving premeditated, systematic abuse of his most vulnerable employees. As he rejoined Elena for the final cleaning tasks, Julian noticed she was moving even more slowly than before. Her face was ashen, and she kept pressing a hand to her chest, wincing in pain. "Elena, are you okay?" "Just tired," she said, but her voice was strained. Julian could see it was more than that. The stress, the physical exhaustion, the constant gnawing fear, it was literally killing her. "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" Elena let out a short, bitter laugh. "Doctors cost money, Leo. My insurance doesn't kick in until I work full-time for 90 days straight. And Mr. Thorne makes sure that never, ever happens." Julian watched her struggle to lift a bag of trash that couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds. This woman was working herself to death for a man who saw her suffering as a form of entertainment. At 6 a.m. sharp, Thorne emerged from his office with a stack of paperwork and a deeply satisfied smile. "Good work tonight, people. Diaz, make sure you're here at 2 p.m. for inventory. Carter, I might have some more shifts for you if you keep this up." As Thorne walked away, whistling tunelessly, Julian felt the immense weight of the evidence on his phone. Tomorrow morning, he would end Victor Thorne's reign of terror. But tonight, he had to watch Elena hobble to her car, knowing she'd be back in just 8 hours to face it all over again. The smoking gun was loaded. Now it was time to fire. Julian didn't sleep that night. He spent the early morning hours in his motel room, a general orchestrating his battle plan. He organized the mountain of evidence, the recordings, the photos, the financial data, into an airtight, irrefutable case. He made a series of encrypted calls, setting the pieces in motion. By 8 a.m., he wasn't just preparing a case against a corrupt manager. He was preparing for war against the culture that had allowed him to flourish. At 1:45 p.m., Julian returned to the store as Leo Carter one last time. He found Elena in the break room, trying to force down a small sandwich despite her obvious nausea. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, the concern in his voice now entirely genuine. "Just need to get through today," she whispered, her eyes full of a desperate hope. "Mateo's specialist appointment got moved up to next week. I can't afford to miss any more hours." Julian felt his resolve harden into steel. This ended today. Now. At 2:10 p.m. sharp, Thorne gathered the afternoon shift for a mandatory inventory training session. About 15 employees stood in a weary semicircle near the customer service desk, including Elena, Sam, Chloe, who was now visibly pregnant and struggling to stay on her feet, and several others Julian now recognized as the victims from Thorne's manipulated schedules. "All right, people, listen up," Thorne announced, his voice booming with the false authority of a man who loved to hear himself talk. "Corporate's breathing down our necks about inventory accuracy, so we're implementing some new procedures." He pulled out a thick clipboard. "From now on, any discrepancies will come directly out of the responsible employee's paycheck. Lost merchandise, miscounts, damaged goods, it all gets deducted from your wages." Julian saw several employees exchange panicked glances. This was flagrantly illegal under federal labor law, and Thorne knew it. "I know some of you might think this is unfair," Thorne continued, his eyes maliciously finding Elena in the crowd. "But maybe if certain people paid more attention to their work instead of worrying about their personal problems, we wouldn't need these measures." The direct, public attack on Elena was the final straw. Julian stepped forward from the back of the group. "Actually, Victor, I think there is something unfair happening here, but it's not what you think." Thorne's eyes narrowed into slits. "Carter, you got something to say?" "Yeah, I do." Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I've got quite a lot to say, actually." He pressed play. The first recording filled the cavernous space. Thorne's voice, crystal clear, boasting about cutting his employees' hours and pocketing the difference through a phantom employee. The effect was electric. Every employee in the circle turned to stare at Thorne, whose face had gone from smug confidence to ashen shock in a matter of seconds. "What the hell is this?" Thorne sputtered, his voice cracking. "This is you." Julian's voice was calm, controlled, but each word landed like a physical blow. "Last night, at 5:30 a.m., explaining to your accomplice how you've been committing felony wage theft and manipulating company schedules." The recording continued, the most damning part yet. "The Diaz woman is the perfect target. Single mother, desperate for the insurance. Her kid needs some kind of special treatment. She'll take whatever abuse I dish out." Elena's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled sob escaping her lips. Around the circle, a low murmur of anger began to build, a rising tide of defiance. "You recorded me! That's illegal!" Thorne shouted, but his bluster couldn't hide the raw panic in his eyes. "Actually, Illinois is a one-party consent state. Perfectly legal," Julian stated coldly. He took a step closer to Thorne, and for the first time, he let the full force of his real authority show through. "But wage theft, benefits fraud, and conspiracy to defraud, those are all federal crimes, Victor." Thorne's eyes darted around the circle of employees, searching for an ally, but all he found were faces hardened with undisguised hatred. "You don't know who you're messing with, Carter. I'll have you arrested for what? Exposing the truth?" Julian reached into his other pocket and pulled out something that made the blood drain from Victor Thorne's face entirely. It wasn't a weapon. It was a simple, elegant business card, embossed with a gold logo. Julian Croft, CEO, Apex Retail. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, Julian could hear the low hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant rattle of a shopping cart, and the sharp collective intake of breath from 15 employees who suddenly understood they were witnessing a corporate execution. "My name isn't Leo Carter," Julian said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable weight of command across the entire store. "I'm Julian Croft. I own this company, and you, Victor Thorne, are finished." The explosion of reactions was instantaneous. Gasps, shocked whispers, a few employees physically stepping back as if from a lightning strike. But Julian kept his eyes locked on Thorne, whose face had cycled through shock, fear, and was now settling into a desperate, cornered animal anger. "You can't do this!" Thorne screamed, his voice shrill. "I have rights! I have a contract!" "You had a contract," Julian corrected him, his voice like ice. "But fraud, as you should know, voids all employment agreements. Security." Two large, imposing security officers, Julian's personal team, who had been positioned discreetly outside since 9 a.m., entered the store and moved purposefully toward Thorne. "Victor Thorne, your employment is terminated, effective immediately. You are also under active investigation for wage theft, benefits fraud, and conspiracy. These officers will escort you from the premises." As the security team moved to flank him, Thorne made one last desperate play. "You can't prove anything. It's their word against mine." He pointed a shaking finger at the assembled employees. "Who are they going to believe? A bunch of—" "Careful." Julian's voice cut through the air like a razor. "I have your own recorded confession. I have the computer log showing every illegal transaction you ever made. I have photographic evidence of every safety violation. And I have something else, Victor." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "I have power. Real power. The kind you've only ever pretended to have." Victor Thorne's shoulders sagged in final, abject defeat as the security officers reached him. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Julian replied, turning to address the stunned employees. "It is. And for all of you, a new beginning is just starting." As Thorne was escorted from the store, past the curious customers who stopped to stare, past the checkout lanes he had used to terrorize his employees, past the glass-walled office where he had orchestrated months of systematic abuse, Julian felt a satisfaction deeper and more profound than any billion-dollar deal he had ever closed. But he knew the real work, the hard work, was just beginning. The silence that descended after Thorne's departure was thick with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning hope. 15 employees stood in a circle, staring at their actual CEO, their minds struggling to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. Julian could see the confusion, the relief, and the deep, bone-weary exhaustion battling for dominance on their faces. Elena was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. You're really the owner?" "I am," Julian said, his gaze sweeping over each employee, making eye contact with every single one of them. "And I owe all of you an apology." He let the words hang in the air, heavy with sincerity. "I built this company on the principle that we take care of our people, but I failed you. I got so focused on the numbers in the boardroom that I lost sight of the people on the ground. And for that, I am truly sorry." Sam, the electronics clerk, stepped forward, still clutching his inventory clipboard like a shield. "So, what happens now? Are we all getting fired for talking to you?" The question hit Julian like a physical blow. These people were so conditioned to fear retaliation that even their own liberation felt like a trap. "No one is getting fired," Julian said, his voice firm. "In fact, we're going to fix everything Victor Thorne broke, starting right now." He pulled out his phone again, but this time, he made a different kind of call. "I'm calling our head of HR. Every illegal hour cut, every stolen wage, every denied benefit. We are going to make it right. Every last cent." Within 20 minutes, Rebecca Chen, Apex Retail's formidable Chief Human Resources Officer, arrived with a team of 3 specialists and a stack of laptops. Julian had worked with Rebecca for 8 years. She was one of the few executives he trusted without reservation. "Rebecca, I need you to conduct emergency audits on every employee file Victor Thorne has touched in the past year. I want full wage restoration, immediate benefit enrollment for anyone who has been illegally denied coverage, and I want it done today." Rebecca's team moved with quiet efficiency, spreading out across the break room and setting up a temporary processing center. "Elena Diaz," Rebecca called out, consulting her tablet. "You've been with us for 3 years, correct?" Elena nodded nervously, still not quite believing any of this was real. "According to Thorne's fraudulent records, you're classified as part-time temporary with no benefits, but your actual hours worked show that you have been a full-time employee for 34 consecutive months." Rebecca's fingers flew across the screen of her tablet. "As of this moment, you are officially classified as a full-time permanent employee, with our complete platinum health coverage, retroactive to your original hire date." Elena's knees buckled. Julian was there to catch her arm as tears, this time tears of overwhelming relief, streamed down her face. "My son's treatment," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's fully covered. The pre-authorization will be processed and approved today," Rebecca said, her voice warm but efficient. "And Elena, according to our initial calculations, you are owed approximately $1,447 in stolen wages and unpaid overtime. A check for that amount will be cut and delivered to you within 48 hours. The sound that escaped Elena's throat was a raw, cathartic mixture of a sob, a laugh, and a prayer. Around the room, other employees were having similar life-altering conversations as Rebecca's team worked meticulously through the corrupted files. But Julian wasn't finished. "Everyone, I need your attention." He stood in the center of the room, his voice once again carrying the authority of a man who had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. "What happened here can never, ever happen again. So, we are changing how this company operates, from the ground up." He gestured to Chloe, the pregnant cashier who had been hiding her condition in fear. "Chloe, how far along are you?" 7 months, she said quietly. "Effective immediately, you are on paid administrative leave until after your full maternity leave ends. That means full salary, full benefits, and a guaranteed position waiting for you when you're ready to return." Chloe's hand went to her belly, her eyes wide with a disbelief that slowly melted into pure joy. Julian continued, turning to Sam. "Sam, you mentioned to Leo that you wanted to move into management one day. How would you feel about becoming this store's new assistant manager? Sam's clipboard clattered to the floor. Sir, I don't have a college degree or... You have something much better, Julian interrupted. You know what it's like to work every position in this store, and you care about the people who work here. That's what I need in my management team. But the biggest, most seismic change was yet to come. Elena, Julian said, turning to face the woman who had unknowingly been the catalyst for this entire corporate revolution. I have an offer for you. She looked up at him, her eyes still red from crying, her mind still struggling to process the fact that her son would finally get the treatment he so desperately needed. I'm offering you the position of store manager. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Rebecca's team stopped typing, their heads snapping up. Sir, Elena stammered, shaking her head. I clean floors. I don't know how to... You know how to work harder than anyone should ever have to, Julian said, his voice ringing with conviction. You know how to care about other people, even when you yourself are being mistreated. You know every single inch of this store and every single challenge these employees face because you've lived them. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. Elena, you've been managing your own impossible situation for 3 years. Managing a store will be easy by comparison. But I don't have the experience. I will provide the training. A full management development program, business courses at the local university, paid for by the company, whatever you need. Your starting salary will be $85,000, plus full benefits and performance bonuses that will be tied directly to employee satisfaction, not just profit margins. Elena stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. $85,000. And that's just the starting point, Julian continued. Good managers who take care of their people get promoted to regional positions. Those pay well into the 6 figures. Around the room, Julian could see the transformation beginning. 15 people who had walked into work that day, expecting another shift of quiet desperation, were watching their lives and their futures change in real time. But the most important change was still to come. One more thing, Julian announced, his voice solemn. We are implementing an employee council at every single Apex retail location. Representatives, elected by the workers themselves, with a direct, open line to corporate leadership. No retaliation, no intimidation, no fear. If something like this ever starts to happen again, you will have a direct line to me to stop it. He pulled out a business card and handed it to Elena. This has my personal cell phone number on it. If anyone, a manager, a regional director, even my own COO, ever treats you or your team the way Victor Thorne did, you call me, immediately. Sam tentatively raised his hand. What about Thorne? Does he just get away with it? Julian's expression hardened. Victor Thorne's case and the evidence against him has already been forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Wage theft of this magnitude is a federal felony. He will face serious criminal charges, and we will be pursuing a civil lawsuit to recover every single penny he stole. Not just from us, but from all of you. Rebecca looked up from her laptop. Speaking of which, Julian, we've already identified similar patterns of fraud at 4 other stores in Thorne's region. It seems he was training other managers in his methods. Then we'll use the same response, Julian said, his voice carrying the weight of an absolute commitment. Full investigations, complete restitution for every affected employee, and anyone involved gets prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. We're not just fixing this store. We are fumigating the entire company. As the afternoon wore on, Julian watched 15 demoralized, isolated individuals transform into something he hadn't seen in his company for a very long time. A real team. People who had been divided by fear were now talking to each other, sharing their stories, discovering in their shared trauma a new, unbreakable bond of solidarity. Elena stood in the center of it all, still wearing her support staff uniform, But she carried herself differently now. The woman who had been weeping in a bathroom that morning was gone, replaced by someone who was just beginning to understand her own strength, her own worth. "Thank you," she said to Julian, her voice steady and clear for the first time since he'd met her. "Not just for the job or the money, for seeing us, for seeing us as people." Julian felt a tightness in his chest, an emotion that went far beyond profit and loss statements. "Thank you, Elena," he said, "for reminding me what leadership is actually supposed to mean." As the sun set over the Chicago skyline, Apex retail store, Wufund 138, looked the same from the outside. But inside, everything had changed. And tomorrow, the real work of rebuilding and revolutionizing would begin.